Good morning.
Morning or good afternoon or good evening.
Yes. Do you want
Yes,
video
good morning.
on or not?
Hi, everyone. I think if you are able to be on video, I think that's great. Makes it feel a bit more alive, even though we're all on our screens. But if it's impossible to be on video, we also understand. I personally will not be on video the whole time because I was telling Dr. Shore and Emily, my little one is homesick with the stomach flu. So we will be off camera listening about Ukrainian identity. Hopefully she's interested in it. And we'll start educating her early on her heritage. So yeah, I think I am going to go ahead and kick it off. I'm sure we'll have a couple people joining late, but I want to be respectful of everyone's busy schedules. And I can see we have most of us here. So I am going to kick it off with a little introduction. Yeah, would love to also get some intros from everyone here in the chat. While we do that, you know, where you're from, maybe how long you've been with Engine. Be great to see. I always love seeing a diverse groups of volunteers that we have at these events and other community members. So as for me, as you may have figured out by my Zoom name, I'm Katerina. I'm the founder and CEO of Engine, and I'm grateful to all of you for taking the time to join us today for this special presentation from Dr. Marci Shore at Yale University. We are also super grateful to Dr. Shore for taking time out of her very busy schedule to visit us and share her expertise on modern Ukrainian history and identity, as detailed in her latest book, The Ukrainian Night: An Intimate History of Revolution, published just this year. I have not read the book yet, but actually just ordered it, very excited to check it out and to get a preview today. So
Looks like Katerina froze there for a second. So I can go ahead and wrap up what she was going to say here. I think, you know, Marci, we're just so grateful to have you join us today. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, sorry about that. Can you hear me, Emily? It says my internet connection is unstable, so I'm just gonna, not sure why, I'm just gonna try.
Sure.
Yeah, so yeah, just let me know if it freezes up again. So yeah, as I was saying, Dr. Shore will be speaking to us about the events that took place on the Maidan in Ukraine and Kiev about 10 years ago, as well as the subsequent revolution in Ukraine. And
oh dear, we're freezing. We're freezing up again, Katerina. So I will go ahead and just kick it off to you, Marci. I know I want just one thing wanted to say that, you know, this event is part of our member program, which is a community of volunteers and donors who commit to making a recurring monthly donation of any size to help Engine stay open. And as most of you know, Engine is a grassroots organization that is funded primarily by our volunteers. So we organize these events as a thank you to our donors, to our monthly members. And so given the subject matter, we really just wanted to open it up to our entire volunteer base. And future events will be exclusive to our members, but this one is open to everybody. So if you enjoy this, please consider joining as an Engine member. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Marci Shore. She is a professor of history at Yale University, where her focus is on modern European intellectual history. So I will go ahead and kick it off or send it over to you, Marci.
Hey, thank you. Well, thank you so much to Emily and Katerina for inviting me. Let me first apologize for the very bleak background here. I'm in Toronto this year. I'm on leave and at this very beautiful place called Massey College at the University of Toronto, but I have just gotten into this new office and I have not yet moved anything into it, which is why the bookshelves look so bleak. And I thought about, it looks very beautiful outside, and I thought about trying to get a nicer background, but I was afraid that would compromise the sound quality and the internet connection. So forgive me for that. I'm very happy to talk to all of you about something I've been kind of living from afar. I'm not sure how long I should talk and how much I should answer questions because I don't really know what is already obvious to everyone and what isn't. The first thing I want to say, though, is it is wonderful what you're doing. One of the things that I have a sense of, both from being close to a lot of people in Ukraine, from being in constant touch with them, and from I've made 3 visits there since the full-scale invasion, of just how terrifying the isolation and how emotionally devastating the isolation can be, and any kind of connection that people going through these very extreme and dire circumstances have to the outside world can be like a lifeline. And the first time I crossed the border into Ukraine after the full-scale invasion, I felt like I was just kind of deluged with all of this love and affection of gratitude just for showing up. And I hadn't even done anything yet. I'll give some lectures, I'll give some talks, I'll give some interviews, I'll do some conversations, but it's not as if I'm actually out there in the field saving anybody or shooting at anybody. I have no useful medical skills. I have no useful military skills. But there really is a sense that it means so much to people not to be alone. It means so much to people to feel like they're seen and they're heard and they have a connection to the world. And a lot of the time I've spent in Ukraine since this war started has been sitting in coffee shops and just talking to people and just listening to them. And I have a sense of just how much that means. It means much more than it does in ordinary times. Okay, so let me talk to you a little bit about I think what Emily had asked me to talk about, which is the revolution on the Maidan, which is now 10 years ago, and it was a historical turning point. And let me first contextualize the story of this revolution. I'm going to tell you, hopefully I won't take too long to do it, which I always have a tendency to do. I want to tell you a story that is about how people change and how societies change and how people grow. I'm going to tell you a very anti-essentialist story. I'm not going to tell you a story about how, Ukrainians have always been one way and Russians have always been another way, and there is some kind of genetic predisposition towards X or Y, or some kind of remarkable continuity since time immemorial of Ukrainian nationhood with X, Y, and Z values. As a historian, I'm very skeptical about fixed identity. There are always contingency always plays an enormous role. Social circumstances play an enormous role. And Ukraine is a very different country now than it was 30 some years ago when the Soviet Union broke up, than it was when I first visited it 20 some years ago, than it was, a dozen years ago. It's a story about how people change and grow and respond. And in that sense, it's a very hopeful story. There's a great book about this, by the way, that was done by social scientists who actually use statistics and data and the kinds of things I don't use. My book about the Maidan is much more impressionistic. But Olga Olnuch and Henry Hale recently wrote a book called The Zelensky Effect, which was based on a group project involving a whole team of social science researchers, both inside and outside of Ukraine, about how Ukrainian society has changed, how values have changed, how attitudes towards democracy and democratic institutions and the obligations of the citizenry have changed. And what they found is that the change has been extraordinary and remarkable in a relatively short period of time. And the Maidan was a seminal turning point, and that's why I want to focus your attention there. So let me start with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. Historians always have this infinite regression problem because wherever you start, there's something that came before that moment that conditioned it. There's no pure starting point. We never start with the tabula rasa. There is no such thing. But for lack of a better moment, let's start with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, which was, in retrospect, seems inevitable, and leading up to that moment was inconceivable. There was, for many, if not most people, it seemed impossible it would ever end in their lifetimes until the moment it did. This is a hope that I clutch on to now looking at Putin's regime. People say it will seem impossible it will ever fall until the moment it does, and then it will retrospectively seem inevitable. The Soviet Union also, let me say this as a reminder, and I think most of you here are old enough to remember this. I now spend a lot of time teaching students who have no memory of this whatsoever. It was the largest, deepest, most far-reaching, grandest social engineering experiment ever known to mankind. In some ways, we are still grappling with the sheer scale of the experiment and the sheer scale of the catastrophe. When it breaks up in 1991, the Soviet Union was comprised of 15 republics, the largest of which was the Russian one. It breaks up. Those other republics either demand or get by default or some kind of messy combination independence, including Ukraine. There was a referendum. In all parts of Ukraine, there was an overwhelming vote for independence, although I think exactly what that meant, nobody knew at the time, as the Soviet Union was breaking up. Ukraine did not fight per se for its independence. There was not a war breaking away from the Soviet Union. The project crumbles. Nobody knows where the pieces are going to land. And Ukraine in some ways gets its independence somewhat by default. And what follows is over a decade of what political scientists have called the blackmail state, a very messy transition from Soviet communism and total state control into what might most accurately be described as kleptocratic oligarchy. This was not only Ukraine, this was certainly Russia and many other places in which the resources that had been monopolized by the state, as they become privatized, basically the people who were well-placed in the communist regime become well-placed to steal the state resources as they're being privatized, and then they become the new oligarchs. So it was a very messy story. There was a lot of lawlessness. There was quite a bit of kind of street violence. There was a lot of corruption, a kind of drowning in corruption. And that goes on, for more or less until 2004, when there's a presidential election between two victors. The first victor, Viktor Yanukovych, was your post-Soviet gangster type from the Donbass, which is the far eastern mining region in Ukraine, who represented continuity with that kind of oligarchy gangsterism. The second victor was Viktor Yushchenko, who seemed to represent westward-looking European integration, moving towards the rule of law. The very short version of that story is that Yanukovych's team, the first victor, tries to poison Yushchenko, in fact, does poison Yushchenko with dioxin. Yushchenko is saved by these Austrian doctors in Vienna, but his kind of grossly disfigured face becomes a symbol of post-Soviet corruption. And then, despite the fact that this has happened, and you would think he would be out of the election entirely, as a result of widespread election fraud, Yanukovych is declared the winner. And at that point, Ukrainians come out onto the street. They come out in particular to the very large square in the center of Kiev called the Maidan, and they demand free and fair elections. It is a completely nonviolent protest. This is November 2004. It lasts for about 3 weeks, and kind of miraculously, and as a result of international pressure, they win. The elections are done over. This time Yushchenko is declared the winner. Everybody's happy and they go home. And there was really a kind of sense of euphoria at the time that they did it. Nobody would have ever thought Yanukovych would come back. It seemed that everybody was moving forward. That was what was called the Orange Revolution. And the short version of that story is that everyone does not live happily ever after. For whatever combination of reasons, Yushchenko does not turn out to be the Messiah figure that had been hoped for, whether he never had been, whether it was due to infighting on his team, in particular with Yulia Tymoshenko, who is a whole other story, whether he was never quite the same after the dioxin poisoning. For whatever combination of reasons, he turns out to be a huge disappointment. Now, nobody would have ever thought that Yanukovych would come back. Not only does he lose the election, but it is exposed that he has poisoned his opponent with dioxin and cheated in the election results. But Yanukovych finds out that across the ocean in Washington, there are people who have a little boutique industry going for gangsters with presidential ambitions. And this speaks to him. He hires one of these PR guys who flies over to Kiev, who doesn't speak Russian, doesn't speak Ukrainian, but does play golf, who plays some golf with Yanukovych, who gives him a little bit of a makeover, who teaches him some tricks about appearing on television, gets him a new haircut. Personally, I didn't see a great difference. I mean, he's still basically a gangster. But Yanukovych comes back, this time legitimately, to win the 2010 elections. And this time, nobody can test the election results. Yanukovych then gives his fancy Washington consultant, as a thank you gift, a $30,000 jar of caviar. I don't even know what one does with a $30,000 jar of caviar, but he gave this $30,000 jar of caviar to his American consultant, whose name you may have heard before. That was Paul Manafort. He will appear later in our story. Yeah, so Ukraine is then kind of languishing under Yanukovych, who is a gangster, and without any particular ideology. There's no utopian vision, there's no eschatological narrative. It's just that the next gangster could be worse. He and his guys steal huge amounts of the country's resources and take them for themselves. There's a lot of brutality, but not mass brutality and violence against the own population. And the carrot that Yanukovych is kind of dangling to the opposition and to the liberal intelligentsia and to the younger generation is that maybe someday, perhaps, we'll get to join the European Union. And he's kind of flirting with this, although he really belongs much more to the Kremlin. And in 2013, November 2013, Yanukovych is due to sign a long-awaited association agreement with the European Union. The agreement is not fantastic. It would have obliged Ukraine to undertake very costly reforms. It clearly would provoke retaliation from the Kremlin. And at the end of the day, it did not promise Ukraine any EU membership. Nevertheless, the association agreement with the EU was hugely symbolic, and it was a foot in the door. It was a clear sign that Ukraine had aspirations to get in line with the rule of law and with European standards of the rule of law. And that provisionally, perhaps, if everything went very well, then Europe might be willing to accept Ukraine. Now, how important this was depended hugely on what your position was. If you were already retired, if you didn't have language skills, if you were living in a small town in the Donbass, whether or not Ukraine joined the EU was perhaps not particularly important to you. If you were a 19-year-old at university thinking, could I learn languages? Could I work for an international corporation? Could I travel? Could I go on Erasmus exchanges? Could I work, could I go to conferences abroad without spending days waiting in lines, humiliating myself, pleading for a European visa? It was everything. Whether or not Europe would be open to you meant everything if you were a young person, if you were upwardly mobile, if you were part of the intelligentsia. So it was very unequal in terms of what this meant. But for the young generation, this was their future. Were the doors of the wider world going to be open to them or not? It was all set. Everything was all agreed. The signing ceremony was going to be in Vilnius. It was all prepared. The pens were on the table. And then suddenly, under pressure from Putin on November 21st, 2013, Yanukovych says, I'm not going to sign. And at that point, there's this feeling, again, not exclusively, but especially among the students, of just devastation. The sense that their future had just been taken from them. This horizon of the future had been taken to them. But interestingly, I mean, this is one of these moments of historical contingency. Nothing might have happened had not a then 32-year-old Afghan-Ukrainian journalist named Mustafa Naim, originally from Afghanistan, from an Afghan-Ukrainian family, had he not posted in Russian on Facebook a little note that afternoon saying, hey, let's be serious. If you're really upset, come to the Maidan by midnight tonight. And then he wrote, likes do not count. And as a historian, I was fascinated by that likes do not count. Interestingly, it was often mistranslated into English, which I don't know why, because it's one of those rare and serendipitous moments when the Slavic translates perfectly into English. Liking nie czytająca, it's literally likes do not count. And what struck me about that is that, you know, this was 2013. I thought, wow, that's a sentence that would have meant nothing before Facebook. It literally would have meant nothing. And now it's going to be the revolutionary slogan for the 21st century. People come out to the Maidan, several hundred, a couple thousand people, mostly but not exclusively students, young people. It's November, it's cold, it's not yet totally freezing. They are holding hands, they're dancing, they're playing music. Their slogan is, Ukraine is Europe. That's it. Nothing else. They're not interested in religious politics. They're not interested in ethnic politics. They're not interested in language politics. They're not interested in the opposition political parties. They want Europe to be open to them. Ukraine is Europe. That's it. That's their whole agenda. You know, that's what they're shouting. There's this atmosphere that is a little bit kind of, you know, parking lot of a Grateful Dead concert-ish, certainly very peaceful. And they are out there, you know, day and night for close to 10 days. And again, it was getting colder and colder. It might have just fizzled out. Protests never last forever. Had not, again, it seems under pressure from Putin, Yanukovych decides to call out his goons, his riot police, Berkut, at 4 a.m. on November 30th to brutally beat up the students and everyone on that square. And that was something that had never happened since Ukrainian independence. There had been individual assassinations of opposition figures, of opposition journalists, of people had been found dead in the woods, but massive public violence against one's own population had not previously happened. And it was a shock. And it seems that Yanukovych was counting on this shock for the parents to come and pull their kids off the streets. And this was where he miscalculated, and this was where something remarkable happened, because rather than pulling their kids off the streets, the parents joined them there. And so suddenly you went from having, you know, several hundred, a couple thousand people on that square to 24, 36 hours later, you have between 500,000 and 1 million people on the streets in Kiev. No one has ever seen that many people on the streets of Kiev. And now they're not just saying Ukraine is Europe. Now they're shouting, we will not permit you to beat our children. And that was really when something like a revolution starts. Something broke in that moment with that violence. That was a fatal miscalculation from Yanukovych's part. That turned out people who never would have imagined that they would come out. And again, as a historian, the thing that fascinated me about this is that the traditional, in some ways, so many implantments of revolution are Oedipal rebellions. Each generation rises up against the fathers in their turn. I mean, that's the typical trope. And so the idea that you now have the parents and the grandparents joining the children is historically a remarkable moment. And you have whole generation, you know, multiple generations started going to the Maidan together. People coming with their parents, people coming with their grandparents, people coming with their children. And the Maidan becomes not just a site of protest, but a whole, what the dissidents used to call a parallel polis, a whole parallel society. a place where people live as if this were the society they wanted it to be. You know, a place where people lived according to the values they were espousing. You know, so suddenly within a day or two, you have massive public kitchens set up. You have clothing exchange points, you have medical points, you have, you have pharmaceutical distribution, an open university, an open library, film screenings, a piano, a stage, you know, people boiling soup in cauldrons, people making coffee, making tea, distributing things. You have this whole parallel society. So now it's not just people protesting on the Maidan, it's people living on the Maidan. People like spending night and day on the Maidan, people coming every day or every night or staying there overnight or staying there in tents, people living there, you know, and they're living in this alternative reality, you know, where they're insisting on certain values. You know, and the details about this also struck me, you know, that how clean the Maidan was. They took care of it. You know, one of the people I interviewed for this book, you know, said the Maidan was so clean, you could eat off the asphalt. You know, they shoveled the snow. Everybody took care of everything communally. Everybody volunteered to do what they could do. You had doctors there treating people who were wounded, treating people who were sick. You had whole teams of people making sandwiches and making soup and distributing food. You had professors giving lectures, you had musicians playing music. It was this whole kind of alternative world that was created there. You know, and as time went on, you know, the government's violence increased. People started to disappear. Sometimes their bodies were found in the woods, often with marks of torture. People who were injured by the riot police would be kidnapped from hospitals and taken away. Teams of people from the Maidan formed to guard patients at hospitals so that they wouldn't be kidnapped by the regime. You know, people with cars formed the Auto Maidan and started responding to SOS calls, you know, if groups of people were being taken by the riot police somewhere. So there was more and more an atmosphere of kind of increasing violence, increasing threat, increasing danger. People that Maidan started building barricades. People started crushing the bricks, you know, and using the crushed bricks to build barricades, using tires to build barricades, making Molotov cocktails. One of the kids, literally a kid at the time I interviewed for this book, Roman Ratushnin, who was 16 at the time, was one of them, the young people who was brutally beaten up on the night of November 30th, and his shoulder was battered in. And when I interviewed him, I mean, he wasn't even a college student, you know, he was a high school student. He was living with his mother, you know, and when I interviewed him in 2014, I said, you know, your mother must have been terribly upset, but she let you go back. And he said, my mother was making Molotov cocktails on Hrushevskova Street. And this people in these months that went through the winter, as the government's violence increased, as people themselves became more and more ready to use violence to defend themselves, people changed. People lost their sense of time. You know, I was kind of fascinated by the temporality of revolution. You know, people started saying to me one after another, was that an hour ago? Was it yesterday? Was it last week? The boundary between day and night became effaced. Suddenly you could call anyone at any hour of the day. It didn't matter. And that, one of the things that was so remarkable, I was watching from afar. I was watching it streamed from Vienna. First of all, the people in the Maidan set up live cameras to live stream themselves. So you turn the cameras on yourself. You violate all your own privacy in the interest of asserting your own narrative in a situation in which the government is controlling the official media. Yeah, so the government maintains control. Yanukovych maintains control of the official media, but the Maidan has the social media. They win in the social media, you know, and they are constantly making themselves visible and trying to get their message out to the world. You could feel almost palpably, even from afar, that, when the people went onto that square on November 21st in response to Mustafa Naim's Facebook post, nobody was thinking we're going to die here or we're willing to die here. And by the second half of January, it was palpable. You could feel that a critical mass of people had reached a decision and they were willing to die there as necessary. And then you were just watching in a kind of state of terror what was going to happen. And it was clear that there was going to be an end game, and it was clear that it was going to be bloody. And that comes in February 2014. When again it seems under pressure from Putin, Yanukovych decides that it's time to try to end this. There's a sniper massacre. More and more people are killed, and in a very concentrated period of time, about 100 people are killed in February 20th and 22nd. The Maidan is burning. There are fires everywhere. At that point, Radek Sikorski, who was then, and now he is again, Foreign Minister of Poland, he and his French and German counterparts fly to Kiev during the massacre to try to negotiate with Yanukovych. The presidential palace is maybe a quarter mile from the Maidan. You can smell the smoke there, and Radek goes in, and tries to talk Yanukovych into a ceasefire. I found this quite remarkable. I mean, he's a very calm person. I'm not a very calm person, but still I said, Radek, you're sitting here with this man. You know that with every additional 5 minutes that goes by, more people are being killed. Is any of that weighing on him at all? And he's like, Marci, he's not that bright. He doesn't have much of an emotional imagination. No, he didn't care at all that these people were being killed. But at a certain point, there's finally a ceasefire deal that Yanukovych agrees to, as well as early elections several months out. Radek goes to, the protesters on the Maidan. They don't want to accept the deal. They don't want Yanukovych in power for another 5 minutes. They're carrying the bodies of their friends, around this square. They've just seen them killed. They have snipers, standing on buildings, just firing at people. And Radek, who's Polish, says, listen, my generation, we grew up with solidarity. In 1981, we underestimated the strength of the regime and we got martial law and mass detention. You take this now, then later you push for more. Otherwise, it's going to be martial law. It's going to be the army. You'll all be dead. And they agreed. But there was a sense of fury. There was a real sense of fury and a sense that a line had been crossed and people were willing to use violence to defend their freedom. And within 36 hours, Yanukovych had just fled. First to Kharkiv to the east, then across the border to Russia. So then, well, first of all, various things. So Yanukovych flees the country. Paul Manafort is now out of a job, and we know what he does next. I mean, this is the beginning of the Trump story. This is one way in which these stories are connected. In the meantime, Putin takes advantage of this vacuum of power. People are mourning the dead. They're carrying coffins around the Maidan. People are exhausted, and they are emotionally spent, and there's no real government in place. So-called little green men, meaning Russian soldiers in unmarked camouflage, show up on the Crimean Peninsula to just take it over, to annex it for Russia before anyone even kind of has a chance to figure out what's going on. And so-called Russian tourists come across the border from Russia, a kind of combination of some randomly paid gangsters and kids and mercenaries and Kremlin agents and soldiers, a kind of hodgepodge of different people to incite separatist rebellions, especially in South and Eastern Ukraine. And the story then that is going through Russian media and Russian television and all through Ukraine is that the Maidan was an American-sponsored conspiracy to install Ukrainian Nazis, in power in Kiev, and that they are then going to be marching east to massacre all the Russian speakers because they are Ukrainian nationalists. Now, I'm sure as all of you already know, since you're working with language and working with Ukrainians, Ukraine has long been a bilingual country, in which people know Russian and Ukrainian. Now, which language is dominant depends on who you're talking to, where they went to school, what part of the country you're in. In general, as a very rough generalization, in the West, Ukrainian is more dominant than Russian, and in the East, Russian has been more dominant than Ukrainian. But that obscures just the depth of the bilingualism and the extent to which most people, most of the time, had daily lives that involved, generally seamlessly, from what I observed, moving back and forth amidst these languages. It's one of the things I always loved about Ukraine. It's one of the bilingualism, I think, has always been one of the strengths of the society. You say, I'm a language person. I believe in bilingualism. I believe in multilingualism. I don't believe it's a source of pain and suffering. I believe it's an extraordinary advantage that the more languages, the better. I love languages. I don't think anybody had been grossly suffering around this for any reason whatsoever. But the language politics that had been manipulated, could be used to say, well, you have these Ukrainian nationalists, they're going to march east and murder all the Russian speakers. There were attempts by the Kremlin to buy some people, to influence other people, so that you have various combinations of, be they Russian military units, or again, mercenaries, or gangs for hire, or Russian nationalists, or people afraid of what they authentically believe are Ukrainian Nazis, rising up and trying to take over local governments. This is tried all over the south and eastern Ukraine. Kharkiv was vulnerable, Dnipro, which was then Dnipropetrovsk, was vulnerable, Odessa was vulnerable. In the end, it only really takes in the Donbass. And you have the creation of these two kind of breakaway republics, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. And that is the beginning, really, of this gruesome war that has lasted till today. And at the time, watching as a historian what was going on in the Donbass, the Ukrainians were in no position to fight at that time. They had just had a revolution to overthrow a gangster president. That guy had fled. They hadn't yet had time to have new elections. They hadn't stripped away the layer after layer after layer of corruption and oligarchy that they had. The Ukrainian army was being crowdfunded on the internet. Civil society organizations were dealing with prisoner exchanges. It was all self-organization, as the Maidan had been. It was all self-organization. It was all civil society. It was all from the bottom up. Unlike in 2004, where you had this Messiah figure who was going to lead you to the promised land, there was a sense of, we have learned our lesson. There are no Messiah figures. We do it ourselves. So the Maidan was a revolution of self-organization. And then the defense of Eastern Ukraine continued that self-organization. It was volunteer networks who were raising money for night vision goggles. It was volunteer networks who were organizing prisoner exchanges and sending people back and forth to the front. It was crowdfunding on the internet. But I looked at it and thought, my God, this is, if you probably remember when Neville Chamberlain infamously comes back to London after the September 1938 Munich conference, at which he has agreed to give Hitler the Sudetenland, and tells the British people how horrible and fantastic it is that we would be trying on gas masks and digging trenches on behalf of a quarrel in a faraway country between people about whom we know nothing. And I thought, wow, the Donbass is going to be that quarrel in the faraway country between people about whom we know nothing. That is going to be the beginning of the Third World War. So from the point of view of Ukrainians, this war did not begin in February 2022. And if you notice, they will always use the phrase, from the full-scale invasion. Instead of saying from the beginning of the war, since the beginning of the war, they say since the full-scale invasion. Because from the point of view of people living in Ukraine, this war has been going on since the spring of 2014. Whereas from the point of view of the rest of the world, we only noticed when there was a full-scale land invasion on a massive scale that Europe was totally unprepared for and could not have imagined since the Second World War. Maybe should I stop there and let you ask questions? Emily, what would be useful? You just let me know what you want me to do.
Marci, I think if you were to continue and talk a little bit more about that transition into the full-scale invasion and how the new kind of Ukrainian identity informed the Ukrainian response to the invasion, and then maybe we can take some questions.
Okay, well, yeah, one thing that Serhii Zhadan, the phenomenal poet and novelist from Kharkiv, has written about this very well. He said, the Russians just don't understand that they're not dealing with the same society they were 10 years ago. If Putin had invaded in 2013, we would have fallen. But he's not dealing with the same people. He's now dealing with people who have a sense of their own agency. And what had been called Euromaidan by the students in November 2013, when everyone comes out on the street in December 2013, that's when Euromaidan just becomes Maidan with no prefix. And now it's not just about the EU. Now it's really about agency. It's about dignity. It's about being treated as a subject and not an object. It's about not being treated as a plaything of the powers that be. It's about what it means to be a responsible citizen. And that the fact that the Maidan was a whole parallel society was fundamental to that, because it was like a do-it-yourself kind of revolution, right? It was a sense of, we can do this from the bottom up. We are not just passive objects. We are not just toys being passed around as chips by these oligarchs. We can take our society, our country, our world in our own hands. And that sense of agency, of subjectivity, what philosophers would call subjectivity, was revelatory. And it's also the case that, so you have all of these students who are at the center of the beginning of it. So say people in their early 20s. Well, 10 years later, they're in their early 30s. They have now come of age. They're now playing crucial roles, in the military, in communications, in the government, and the Maidan was transformative for them. Their sense of that is like, no one does this for us. We are responsible for ourselves, and we don't want to live as slaves. We don't want to live as objects of the powers that be. The deaths that they mourned on the Maidan were life-changing for those people. One of the people who is now playing a crucial role in strategic communications was from Lviv. He was on the Maidan the whole time with a close friend of his. They were both just about to start. They were starting graduate school in history. And his friend, Bogdan Solchanik, was killed by a sniper. And that sense of, the sense of survivor's guilt that everybody has, even if it's not logical, like, why was it Bogdan and not me? Gave Mykola an extraordinary sense of responsibility. He then, joined the Ukrainian army, and then he went into intelligence, and now but that was formative, this sense of that, if we don't want to live as slaves, if we don't want to be subject to brutality, we have to create the society we want ourselves. And that when, in February 2022, when those Russian troops were built up along the border, and I was working on a piece at the time for the Wall Street Journal, and literally in that like 10 days before February 24th. And the editors kept asking me, they said, is Putin going to invade? Is Putin going to invade? And I said, listen, Russia is such a vertical society that decision exists in the mind of one man. And I have no privileged epistemological access to what's going on in his head. I don't know. And they said, but you're sure that if he invades, the Ukrainians will fight? And I said, yes, I'm sure. And they said, how do you know? I said, I just know. And I know not because I have some secret privileged information that other people don't have. I know because anyone who spent any time in Ukraine in the past few years knew that. I mean, you didn't have to, even if you had flown into Kiev, say in, 2021, not knowing Russian, not knowing Ukrainian, say you stopped over on a flight somewhere else and you like went out to dinner and to a concert, you would fly away a few hours later, knowing enough to know that no one in Kiev wanted to see the Russian army there. Not the people who preferred to speak Russian, not the people who preferred to speak Ukrainian, not the people who loved Tolstoy. Nobody wanted to see the Russian army there. The whole idea that, that there's this affinity of language, it's if you could, when I was briefing politicians about this in that time right after the full-scale invasion, about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine and the Russian language, I said, we as native English speakers are in a particularly good position to understand that people speak English in different countries. And there are lots of people who have families across the border. I'm talking to you from Toronto now. Lots of people in Toronto have cousins in Philadelphia. There are lots of people here who have lived in different places in the States who wouldn't mind going to school in New York, or Omaha or anywhere else. Like it's a soft border. The American-Canadian border is a soft border, the way the Russian-Ukrainian border had been a soft border. You didn't need to invade Crimea. Any Russian could just calmly go on vacation in Crimea. Nobody was stopping anybody. It was very easy. So I asked these American politicians, I said, okay, imagine January 6th had gone the other way. Imagine we were living under some kind of fascist dictatorship, and under the guise of making America great again, the American army decides to invade Canada and start shelling Toronto. Well, would anyone say, well, they speak English there, and they also like hamburgers and French fries. So really, we're the same people. There's a lot of cultural affinity. So why would they mind that we're bombing our city? I mean, that's kind of the situation. Like, yes, there's lots of cultural affinity and there's lots of, shared recipes and there are lots of families on both sides of the border. But what the Russians have done, it's not about, would you like to live in Kiev or would you like to live in Moscow? They are just coming in and slaughtering people en masse, and the Ukrainians knew what was coming because these areas in the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic become reigns of terror. And there's a remarkable book by a remarkable young writer named Stanislav Asayev, who was a philosophy student in Donetsk, in the Donbass. And after the separatists and the Russians took over and turned that into the Donetsk People's Republic, he was writing weekly feuilletons, kind of essays about life in this taken over breakaway republic for Radio Liberty. He was writing for Radio Liberty under a pseudonym. And in 2017, he's caught by the separatists and imprisoned and subjected to the most gruesome torture methods by basically the same guys and some Russians, who were the guys he used to wait in line at the bakery with, for almost 3 years until he is finally released in a prisoner exchange with Kiev. He's an extraordinary writer. He writes a memoir that's now been translated into English called The Torture Camp on Paradise Street. That these places were not just prisons. I mean, they were just the most gruesome reigns of terror in which people were regularly tortured with electric shock. There was just massive violence for no reason. And so the people who were familiar with what was happening in the Donbass, Ukrainians knew what was coming. They knew this wasn't like, well, lots of people in Kiev have studied in Moscow. That would be a perfectly normal thing to do. But now you have something else that's going on. I mean, now you have an aging tyrant, who perhaps facing his own mortality, has just decided on a sadomasochistic frenzy. And they're just going into places and slaughtering and torturing people for no rational reason whatsoever. And then declaring victory on the ruins. You burn Mariupol to the ground. You bury thousands of people and lots of children under rubble. You suffocate people. You make them die of thirst. You throw them in dungeons. You torture them with electric shocks. And then when there is nothing left, you raise your flag and say, we've won. I mean, that kind of reign of terror makes it for the Ukrainians not morally sustainable to say we can come up with a peace agreement. Because from their point of view, it's like asking, some part of the Jewish population of Europe to remain under Nazi occupation. Because these zones, it's not an issue about land for them. It's an issue about people, because these areas have been reigns of terror. Now, the question about the real kind of existential, ideological, historical question is, where does this terror come from? Where does this violence come from? Why are Russians going along with that? And that becomes more of a kind of metaphysical, sociological question. But from the point of view of Ukrainians experiencing it, it's a kind of terror that there's just no way not to give up, because it's just not sustainable. And if you read Stanislav Asayev's book, you will understand that.
Thank you, Marci. I see that we have one more question in the chat about Yanukovych's reluctance, or he did not sign the EU agreement. Did Ukraine still have nuclear weapons or any type of security agreements from Europe? Could it be that Putin threatened to invade?
Putin was constantly throwing around his weight. We don't know exactly what he said to Yanukovych. What we do know, and what the Ukrainians are understandably resentful for, is that Ukraine gives up its weapons after the fall, gives up its nuclear weapons after the fall of the Soviet Union in exchange for security guarantees in a document known as the Budapest Memorandum, which involved security guarantees from both the Russian Federation and the United States. Obviously, neither one of those was worth very much, as it turns out. So Ukraine no longer has nuclear weapons. They gave them up 30 years ago. And there's no meaningful security guarantees not having been a member of NATO. And this is really the whole question. And the world thought, and certainly Russia thought, that Kiev was going to fall in 3 days. I don't know anything about military anything. Well, now I know a little bit because people have tried to coach me, but certainly in February 2022, I knew absolutely nothing. I deal with intellectual history. I write about history of philosophy, history of ideas. But the military people said, Marci, if you know what you're talking about, when you look at those huge convoys, those huge lines of Russian tanks heading towards Kiev, the fact that they were supplied in a very limited way, the fact that they had their dress uniforms, they were absolutely expecting to just roll into Kiev and be greeted and be having a victory parade in 3 days. They did not expect resistance. One, I think there was some kind of insane idea that they might be welcomed, but two, there was a sense that there's no way this country has the resources to fight. And that was another moment of historical contingency, because if you remember, September 1938, Edward Beneš in Czechoslovakia decides not to fight. He goes into exile. In Czechoslovakia, people decide not to fight. And this was the critical moment, even when it seemed crazy, because it seemed that there's no way, they don't have the weapons, they don't have the people. Russia's much bigger, it's much more well supplied, they have many more troops. Moreover, they have a tyrannical leader who does not care how many of his own people he kills, who's willing to burn through his whole population and bleed through all his people. Zelensky, there was there's assassination groups out there to get Zelensky, and Zelensky goes out into the street with like 4 of the guys from his presidential administration and films that famous selfie video where he says, I, the president, am here. We are here. We are not running away. We're going to defend our country. And that was an existential moment of decision-making that changed the world. Had that not happened, we would be living in a different world now. But he goes out, makes that decision, and there's an overwhelming sense among the Ukrainians that they are willing to fight and that they have to fight. But without weapons from somebody else, there would have been no possibility. And then the kind of the agonizing, maddening thing is watching those weapons dribble out, just a little bit at a time. I mean, I think if everyone had just given them everything from the beginning, I think it could have been over. I think there were moments it could have been over, but there was like, okay, we'll give you 1 tank, we'll give you 2 tanks, we'll give you this, but not that. We don't want to provoke Russia, and okay, tanks, but not planes. Okay, okay, you know, we'll give you some long range missiles, but you can't use them to attack the launching sites in Russia. And so it's been this kind of hair tearing, you know, and then they're very dependent on foreign money. NATO and Europe had not been prepared for a land war. They were not funding defense spending like the way they might have been, because it wasn't supposed to happen anymore in the 21st century. You know, and then you have Mike Johnson holding up the supplemental. When I was in Kiev in March, you know, everyone lives according to the rhythm of the air raid alarms. You all have this app on your phone, which I'm sure you've noticed from your English language students or friends that you're working with, you know, and the air raid alarm goes off, and then you go into the bomb shelter, or you take your chances and don't go into the bomb shelter, you know, and everyone in March was counting down the air defense ammunition, because it was running out day by day and missile by missile, you know, and everybody knew that once that air defense ammunition ran out, that was the end for Kiev. That's a city that's completely dependent on air defense. You know, and I was like, I was sitting with my friend Amelia. There was one morning that just in a 3-hour period on March 21st, the Russians sent 31 cruise and ballistic missiles just to Kiev. You know, and Ukrainian air defense miraculously intercepted all 31. They've gotten extremely skilled, but there's still a lot of casualties because the pieces fall out of the sky, you know, and then lots of things are destroyed. It cost a huge amount of money. And when we came out of that bomb shelter, you know, I was asking a diplomat friend, I'm like, you know, just out of curiosity, like, how much money did those missiles cost? You know, so those 31 missiles the Russians sent that morning, all 31 of which were intercepted, that was $390 million worth of missiles in a country in which millions of people are too poor to afford indoor plumbing. Yeah. And my friend Arad, who's the Austrian ambassador, he's texting me, he's like, Marci, do you know how many schools you could build in Russia for that money? Putin doesn't care. He will burn through all his country's resources. So you're dealing with this kind of maniac nihilist who just doesn't care. I mean, it's just sheer destruction. You just destroy everything. Right? Mariupol was a beautiful city. Now it's destroyed for everybody. I mean, it's just, it can't, there's no rational position of negotiation. It's just this kind of sadomasochistic frenzy, you know, and so to ask the Ukrainians to kind of sit down with Putin there's no rational actor to sit down with. I mean, this is someone who just wants to kill you. I mean, he likes killing people. I mean, if you say like, okay, everyone acts rationally, okay, he likes killing people, therefore it's rational for him to use all his resources to kill people. But then you've expanded the definition of rationality to the point where it's effectively meaningless.
Marci, thank you so much. I know we're about at the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Just wanted to let everyone know that we will be sending out the recording in our next volunteer newsletter of the presentation, and also provide some follow-up resources that Marci so generously provided us, a long reading list to help contextualize the current situation in Ukraine. If you are interested in purchasing Dr. Shore's book, I'm going to go ahead and drop that link in the chat. And she did tell me that the paperback version is the one you want because it has a new foreword regarding the invasion of the.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Right.
Yeah, because when it came out in paperback, the book had come out about the Maidan in 2018, and I wanted to follow. It's a story about people. It's really a story about my friends and colleagues and the friends and colleagues of my friends and colleagues. And the new preface follows those people into the war. And I guess the last thing I'll say, like one of the characters in that book, Roman Ratushny, the 16-year-old who was on the Maidan from the beginning to the end, he was incredibly brave. His mother was the one making Molotov cocktails on Khrushchevskaya Street. He joined the military immediately after February 24th, and he was killed on the front in June 2022.
Thank you again. I know this is going to help all of us really understand, you know, the context as we communicate to our students and as we communicate to our friends in Ukraine, especially younger people. So thank you again, Marci, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for all that you do for Engine.
Mhm.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
for
That
inviting
was really
me.
good.
Have a good day.